national crises, foreign policy, travel, political pressure. The White House was constantly active, constantly watched, constantly moving, and Jacqueline often felt emotionally isolated inside it. At the same time, she was painfully aware of her husband's infidelities. Though rarely discussed publicly during that era, John Kennedy's relationships with other women became one of the great emotional wounds within the marriage. Jacqueline almost never confronted these issues publicly. Instead, she focused her energy on her children, her restoration projects, literature, art, and creating emotional stability wherever she could. Many people later described Jacqueline as someone who mastered emotional survival through composure. She protected herself by remaining controlled and private. But even the strongest composure cannot fully shield a person from grief. In 1963, tragedy struck the Kennedy family once again. Jacqueline gave birth prematurely to a baby boy named Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. The infant survived only 2 days. The loss devastated both Jacqueline and President Kennedy. For Jacqueline especially, Patrick's death created profound emotional exhaustion. Friends later recalled seeing deep sadness and fragility beneath her normally controlled exterior. Yet despite her grief, Jacqueline continued fulfilling public responsibilities while the eyes of the world remained fixed upon the White House. Then came November 1963. In many ways, the atmosphere surrounding the Kennedy presidency had begun changing. Cold War tensions remained high. Political hostility was growing. The pressures surrounding the administration were intensifying. Still, few people could have imagined how suddenly everything would collapse. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline traveled to Dallas, Texas, for a political trip intended to strengthen support ahead of the next presidential election. The day began with crowds cheering along the streets, people waving, smiling, children reaching to see the president and first lady. Jacqueline wore a pink suit that would later become permanently associated with one of the darkest moments in American history. As the presidential motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza, gunshots suddenly rang out. Chaos erupted instantly. Confusion, screaming, panic. President Kennedy had been shot beside his wife. In a matter of seconds, Jacqueline's entire world shattered. The images from that day became permanently embedded in the memory of the nation. Jacqueline climbing across the back of the limousine in shock and terror. Secret Service agents rushing toward the vehicle. The frantic drive to Parkland Hospital. Inside the hospital, doctors fought desperately to save the president. But the wounds were catastrophic. John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead that afternoon. He was only 46 years old. Jacqueline, still wearing blood-stained clothing, remained beside him. One of the most haunting aspects of the tragedy was her extraordinary composure in the midst of unimaginable trauma. Even while emotionally shattered, Jacqueline understood that the world was watching. History was unfolding around her in real time. And somehow she continued moving forward through the nightmare. She accompanied her husband's body back to Washington. She stood beside Lyndon B. Johnson during the presidential oath aboard Air Force One. She comforted her children, and she faced a grieving nation while carrying overwhelming personal devastation herself. Millions of Americans watched the funeral ceremonies in stunned silence. The image of young John Jr. saluting his father's coffin became one of the most iconic photographs in American history. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy entered a completely different phase of life. The world still saw her as the grieving widow of a fallen president, an American icon frozen in tragedy. But behind that public image was a woman struggling to survive emotionally while raising 2 young children under relentless global attention. Everywhere she went, cameras followed. Photographers waited outside buildings. Reporters analyzed her clothing, her movements, her friendships, even her expressions. There were moments when Jacqueline could barely leave her home without being surrounded by media attention. The pressure became exhausting, and beneath it all was something even deeper: fear. Jacqueline had witnessed political violence firsthand. She had watched her husband die beside her. And in the years that followed, additional assassinations only intensified her anxiety about safety and public life. In 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother and another major figure in American politics, was assassinated during his own presidential campaign. The tragedy devastated the Kennedy family once again. For Jacqueline, it reinforced a terrifying reality. The people she loved seemed constantly surrounded by danger. After Robert Kennedy's assassination, Jacqueline reportedly told friends that she feared the Kennedy family itself had become a target. She desperately wanted protection and stability for her children. And it was during this emotionally vulnerable period that her relationship with Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis became increasingly serious. Aristotle Onassis was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world. Older than Jacqueline, he lived inside a world of enormous luxury, private islands, yachts, international business, and global influence. To many people, the relationship seemed surprising. Some Americans were shocked when Jacqueline married Onassis in 1968. The public reaction was intense. Critics accused her of abandoning the Kennedy legacy. Others felt emotionally betrayed, as though America's symbolic widow now belonged to another world entirely. The media scrutiny became relentless once again, but very few people fully understood Jacqueline's emotional state at the time. She had spent years living inside grief, fear, trauma, and constant public observation. Marriage to Aristotle Onassis represented something she desperately wanted: security, protection, distance from political tragedy, and perhaps a chance to finally escape the crushing expectations attached to the Kennedy name. Yet even within this new marriage, Jacqueline's life remained emotionally complicated. The world of Aristotle Onassis was glamorous but often isolating. Luxury surrounded her constantly: private yachts, exclusive parties, international travel, famous guests, enormous wealth. But wealth does not erase loneliness, and Jacqueline often seemed emotionally detached from the extravagant world around her. Many people who knew her later said she never fully felt at home within Onassis's lifestyle. She remained deeply intellectual, private, and emotionally cautious. At times, she appeared caught between identities, too famous to live normally, too guarded to fully trust the world around her, and forever linked to the memory of President Kennedy no matter where life carried her. When Aristotle Onassis died in 1975, Jacqueline once again found herself entering a new chapter alone. But this time something changed. Rather than living only as a public figure associated with tragedy and mythology, Jacqueline began reclaiming parts of herself that had existed long before the White House. The intellectual woman, the reader, the editor, the observer, the lover of literature and history. She moved into the publishing world and began working as a book editor in New York City. To some people, the decision seemed surprising. After all, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis could easily have lived quietly in luxury for the rest of her life. But work gave her purpose, meaning identity beyond public image. She worked first at Viking Press, and later at Doubleday. Colleagues described her as intelligent, professional, detail-oriented, and deeply knowledgeable about literature, art, and culture. Unlike the glamorous image the public often projected onto her, Jacqueline herself preferred thoughtful conversation, books, museums, and privacy. She read constantly, studied history constantly, and remained fascinated by ideas throughout her life. At the same time, she became fiercely protective of her personal boundaries. Years of media obsession had left deep emotional scars. She valued privacy intensely and tried to shield her children from the pressures she herself had endured. Even as she aged, public fascination with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis never disappeared. People remained captivated by her elegance, mystery, and emotional resilience. Photographs of her walking through New York City became iconic. Dark sunglasses, carefully composed expressions, a calm and controlled presence that revealed almost nothing publicly about her inner world. But perhaps that mystery was part of why the world remained fascinated by her for so many decades. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis represented something larger than celebrity. She symbolized composure under unimaginable pressure, grace during grief, and survival after public tragedy. Yet beneath the symbolism was still the same deeply human woman who had once loved books, art, horseback riding, and quiet observation long before history transformed her life forever. Even decades after her death, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis remains one of the most recognizable and fascinating women in modern history. There are former First Ladies remembered briefly by history, others remembered mainly through politics. But Jacqueline Kennedy became something much larger: a cultural symbol, a historical myth, an image permanently connected to one of the most emotional eras in American history. Part of that fascination comes from the extraordinary contrast within her life. The world often saw glamour, beauty, fashion, elegance, luxury, but behind those images was a woman shaped deeply by loneliness, grief, emotional restraint, and survival. That contrast continues to captivate people even today, because Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis represented something emotionally complex. She appeared fragile and strong at the same time, reserved yet intensely influential, quiet yet unforgettable. Even the way she spoke seemed carefully measured, soft, controlled, deliberate, as though every word passed through layers of thought before reaching the public. Over time, historians and cultural critics began recognizing that Jacqueline understood something many public figures did not fully understand during her era. The power of imagery, the power of atmosphere, the power of historical memory. Perhaps nowhere is that more visible than in the creation of the Camelot myth surrounding the Kennedy presidency. In the days after President Kennedy's assassination, America was emotionally shattered. The country was grieving not only a president, but the sudden destruction of a national ideal. Youth, optimism, hope, the future itself suddenly seemed uncertain. And Jacqueline understood instinctively that memory could shape history forever. During an interview with journalist Theodore White shortly after the assassination, Jacqueline referenced the Broadway musical Camelot. She described the Kennedy years as a brief shining moment that would never come again. That single comparison changed how millions of people emotionally remembered the Kennedy presidency. Camelot became more than a phrase. It became mythology, a romanticized vision of youth, elegance, intelligence, tragedy, and lost possibility. And in many ways, Jacqueline herself became the guardian of that myth. Yet one of the most fascinating aspects of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is how carefully she protected her private self from public consumption. Despite living under constant media attention for decades, very few people truly knew her deeply. She rarely gave revealing interviews, rarely exposed raw emotion publicly, rarely allowed the world to fully enter her inner life. Instead, she maintained distance, composure, mystery, and perhaps that mystery became part of her enduring power. People projected meaning onto her. Grace, sophistication, sadness, strength, elegance, survival. She became almost like a mirror reflecting whatever emotions and ideals people associated with the Kennedy era itself. Her influence also permanently changed the role of First Lady in the United States. Before Jacqueline Kennedy, First Ladies were often viewed primarily through domestic or ceremonial expectations. But Jacqueline brought something different. Cultural influence, historical preservation, international sophistication, artistic appreciation, and media awareness. She understood that public image could shape diplomacy, perception, and even national identity. Future First Ladies would operate in a world Jacqueline helped redefine. Even her influence on fashion became historically significant. Her clothing choices, hairstyles, and overall presentation created global trends during the 1960s. But unlike ordinary celebrity culture, Jacqueline's image carried political and emotional symbolism at the same time. She represented refinement during a rapidly changing and often turbulent period in American history. Yet perhaps the reason Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis continues to fascinate people most deeply is because her story feels profoundly human beneath the mythology. A young woman searching for identity, a daughter affected by family instability, a wife navigating betrayal and loneliness, a mother devastated by loss, a widow traumatized by violence, a public figure trapped beneath relentless attention, and finally, a woman trying to reclaim meaning and privacy after history transformed her life forever. The world often remembers the photographs first. The pink suit, the dark sunglasses, the White House tour, the funeral procession, the elegant gowns, the carefully composed expression. But behind every famous image was a real human being carrying emotions far heavier than the public could fully see. Fear, grief, isolation, responsibility, pressure, and resilience. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis once said that if you fail to raise your children properly, nothing else you do matters very much. In many ways, that statement revealed more about her true priorities than any public speech or magazine photograph ever could. Because despite the glamour, politics, wealth, and mythology surrounding her life, Jacqueline remained deeply focused on protecting the people she loved. And perhaps that is why her story still feels emotionally powerful generations later. Not because she lived inside history, but because she endured it, gracefully, quietly, and in full view of the entire world.